In the early morning hours, cloaked in darkness, long before the first delicate rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the pulse of the bustling Korean metropolis was already awake. The port of Seoul, however, was almost always a hive of activity, regardless of the time of day. Workers in sturdy overalls moved purposefully across the deck of a massive cargo ship docked at the pier. Under the glow of the port lights, they loaded heavy crates and barrels onto trucks, the metallic clang of descending cranes slicing through the silence. The port was a hub for commerce and the exchange of goods, the soft lapping of water against the boats, the throbbing of the engines on the fishing vessels, and the rhythmic clatter of the dockworkers formed a symphony of industry. It was an ordinary morning at the port of Seoul. But on this day, something extraordinary was about to occur. Again, because suddenly, as if reality itself had begun to fray, a massive orange-tinged portal opened in the sky above the port. A thunderous roar accompanied the spectacle, as the people working nearby came to an abrupt halt, their eyes lifting toward the now orange-glowing night sky in utter bewilderment. The moment the portal drew everyone's attention felt as if time itself had paused for a heartbeat. Even the gentle lapping of the water and the hum of the fishing boat engines seemed to fall silent. The stillness was palpable, as the portal expanded, unfurling into a blinding light. The confusion among the people at the port of Seoul gave way to sheer terror. Their eyes widened in fear and disbelief, and their hearts raced as an unimaginable sight emerged from the portal. A colossal woman, encased in a shimmering aura of light, with a height that defied comprehension, stepped forth from the radiant glow. As the portal closed and the light dimmed, her form nearly vanished back into the darkness of the night. Only her dark silhouette was discernible in the moonlight, but the most astonishing aspect of this towering apparition was her sheer size. Towering at an astonishing 300 meters, she loomed over the city spread out before her. As she began to stride through the port, her bare feet created a mighty splash with each step in the water. The people at the port of Seoul, who witnessed this incredible appearance, were utterly stunned. They stared with eyes wide open at the enormous silhouette of the woman. Unable to fathom what was happening, their faces reflected a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, confusion, disbelief, and sheer terror. Some ran wildly, frantically searching for a safe place to hide. The fishing boats in the harbor were tossed about by the waves generated by Barbie's arrival, while the trucks on the massive cargo ship were knocked over by the sudden chaos. Those who managed to keep their composure grabbed their phones and began taking photos and videos of the colossal stranger. However, the poor image quality due to the low light made it difficult to discern the giantess. Despite the rapid spread of news about Barbie's arrival on social media, her identity remained a mystery. Barbie was acutely aware of the effect her presence had on people. Her gaze swept over the tiny figures at the harbor, who looked up at her with a mix of awe and fear. She slowly raised a hand and gave a gentle wave, a mischievous smile playing across her lips to signal her kindness and peaceful intentions. It was a surreal scene, the gigantic American standing over the port of Seoul, admired and feared by the people below. Barbie was glad it was night. She didn't want to reveal her identity just yet. Perhaps someday, but not now, and she wanted to get this over with quickly, so she bent over the docks and lowered her open hand to the shore, allowing the many tiny Koreans within it to climb down. One of them was Sun-nam. She was still processing the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. She was in a group of people enclosed by the colossal fingers of the giantess. She could feel the warmth emanating from Barbie's skin all around her. Then, the grip loosened, the fingers rose, and the open palm was laid flat on the ground. Sun-nam immediately knew where she was when she saw the iconic neon signs and lights of Seoul City in the background. I'm home. She quickly crawled over the soft surface of Barbie's hand to the edge, carefully climbing down like the others. A young man helped her along. And as soon as she was back on solid ground, she felt a sudden longing for the sensation of being in the giantess's hand. How strange! She looked up once more at Barbie, whose entire upper body was just a silhouette in the darkness. Sun-nam recalled how she'd been chased, captured, and even swallowed by the giantess, and now she was alive again, without understanding how it was possible. Those were traumatic experiences, yet she felt a peculiar connection. And it seemed as though the giantess had been exceedingly careful to ensure no harm came to them. She couldn't make sense of it all, but she knew the time for parting had come, and that she would miss the giantess. She hoped to see her again someday, somewhere. Meanwhile, the people at the harbor were frozen in a state of shocked reverence and fear. They stared at the enormous American woman gazing down at them as if she had come from another world. No one knew who she was or how she had gotten here, but they all could see she didn't seem to pose a threat. Was she just bringing people home? But how? And who were they? And what was really going on? Take care, Barbie whispered, but her voice was still loud enough to be heard across the entire harbor. She waved one more time to the rescued Koreans and was just glad they were safe and sound, instead of being digested by Rudo or her own stomach. Just as she thought this, a bluish sparkling light orb emerged from her bracelet. What on earth? She wondered. Isn't that the thing Rudo used to restore the people we swallowed? Why, then she noticed it had appeared just when she thought about the Koreans she'd consumed. Apparently, this thing, whatever it was connected to her thoughts. Could that be it? However, it vanished back into her bracelet. Good to know, Barbie said to herself. She was gaining more and more abilities, which was great if she wanted to be a hero. And occasionally, have some fun as a giantess. Slowly, Barbie stood back up and opened another portal. She was dead tired and just wanted to sleep. Just as quickly as she'd arrived, she vanished into a blazing rectangle of orange light. She'd configured the portal to shrink her back to her normal size as she passed through it, fortunately, because otherwise, she would have likely destroyed her home. Once home, she quickly got ready for bed and went to sleep, even though in Miami, the sun was still up. Damn time zones. On the planet Magra, Ryung sat cross-legged in the center of the Asian-themed room. The floor was made of polished dark wood, reflecting the soft glow of the artful lamps that hung from the ceiling. These lamps were designed like giant lanterns, their exteriors covered with Magra paper, which emitted a warm, gentle light. The walls were also crafted from wood and this distinctive paper in an Asian style. One wall was adorned with a large painting depicting historical landscapes and calligraphy, adding to the room's elegance. Before her, the hologram of Empress Ailey Emperor hovered. As a hologram, she was almost as tall as Ryung, despite the Asian woman being a 160-meter tall giantess. How are the efforts to overcome the energy crisis coming along? Ryung inquired with genuine interest. The Empress nodded thoughtfully. They're progressing well, thanks to your and Lix's help. We've established various alternative energy sources, including fusion energy, zero-point energy, and we've purchased some very powerful solar collectors from another planet. They work quite well, but we still need energy crystals to meet all our needs. Ryung nodded satisfied. That's good to hear. And don't worry, we'll continue to supply energy crystals until you've overcome this crisis. The Empress blushed slightly. Well, now that you mention it, we'll soon need another shipment, and we have another problem. Ryung raised an eyebrow. Oh. What problem? Ailey cleared her throat. Some cities are responding very slowly to the crisis and aren't showing much enthusiasm to change the old systems. As a result, we're still consuming far more energy crystals than planned. It seems they don't fully grasp the seriousness of the situation, and I don't know how to convince them to act more swiftly. Ryung suddenly grinned broadly. I have an idea. Actually, it's quite timely, because I was planning to train with someone on your planet anyway. If you don't mind. Of course not. I trust you completely, replied the Empress. But what exactly do you have in mind? Ryung smiled. We're just going to destroy the old generators. Can you give me the coordinates? A few hours later on Earth, something vibrated on Barbie's wrist. What is it now? She opened her eyes and saw that it was still the middle of the night. Oh, how long have I been asleep? She wondered as she checked her wristband computer. There was a message. Hey Barbie, can you come to Magra? I have a mission for you. Barbie was instantly wide awake. She hadn't even told Ryung about her adventure with Rudo where they saved people from a burning city, and of course, she was interested in a mission. She leaped out of bed and began to prepare for the mission, even though it was still the middle of the night, at least in the United States. A short while later, she stood in front of the mirror, inspecting her outfit. Yellow shorts and a purple shirt. The colors matched pretty well with the high-tech wristband she wore. Just in case, she also put on her favorite sandals. She probably wouldn't need them, but if the mission involved rescuing people from yet another burning city or something, it was better to be prepared. She was ready. With a few quick gestures, she opened a portal in front of her. It looked almost like stepping through a mirror. But beyond the event horizon, another world awaited her, Magra. Even though she had been here before, she had to admit that Magra was a fascinating planet. Especially at her current size, because she had forgotten to grow larger. As an average-sized human, the massive mushrooms and plants seemed truly awe-inspiring, stretching toward the sky. High above the canopy of leaves, birds soared through the air, making the extinct pterosaurs of Earth look tiny. Barbie looked down at her wristband to find the function to enlarge herself. How big should she be today? Lix was a bit over 200 meters tall. How tall was Ryung again? Whatever. 200 meters seemed like a good size. She entered the desired size, and almost immediately, she began to grow. It was always an amazing feeling, the incredible power coursing through her body as she expanded and grew larger and larger. Everything around her grew smaller as the plants became almost normal size to her. Well, almost. Most trees looked normal-sized, but here and there were giant redwoods. And some mushrooms were still large enough to sit on. This planet was really funny. It was like a scene out of a fantasy film. She stood on the edge of the forest, looking at the mountain where Lix lived in the distance. She knew there were many small settlements built into the ground there, and since she still didn't understand the shield function on her wristband, she was careful where she stepped. It would be pretty embarrassing if she accidentally squashed some of Lix or Ryung's friends. She approached the garden with the many small settlements, which were enclosed in glass boxes set into the ground, and waved to the little people who lived there and were looking up at her. Hello, little ones. Don't mind me. I'm just on my way to see Ryung. Carefully, she walked along the narrow path for giants between the settlements and curiously observed the tiny people from above. How must it feel for Lix to have an entire civilization in her garden? But she couldn't dwell on it too long, as she always had to watch where she stepped. Just as she was about to put her foot down, a strange little creature, being chased by 3 children, darted under her foot. Barbie flinched and quickly lifted her foot. Sorry, one of the children shouted, waving at her. Then all 3 ran off with the creature. Barbie watched them leave, concerned. Be more careful next time. I almost stepped on you. And what was that animal? It looked like a dog but had 6 legs and a small antler on its head. What planet could it have come from? Its small size suggested it wasn't native to Magra. In contrast, Ryung's hut was immense, built in an Asian style. As Barbie approached, she made sure to set her feet gently to avoid causing any unintended damage. Still, she felt the subtle tremors under her weight with each step, a gentle yet noticeable rhythm. It was impressive how the earth always seemed to tremble beneath her. Being giant felt entirely different. Ryung was already waiting. The towering Asian giantess stood at the entrance with her arms crossed and a broad smile. It was a wooden terrace with large Asian sliding doors, and they were tall enough for Barbie to pass through without bending, despite her chosen size being quite taller than Ryung's. Welcome, Barbie. Glad you made it so quickly, Ryung called in a friendly tone. Barbie smiled, removed her sandals, and entered the building, greeted by a pleasant fragrance. Ryung must have brewed some good tea. The aroma lingered in the air. Hey, Ryung. I hurried because I wanted to know what the mission was. Teehee. Barbie said, looking around with curiosity. Upon closer inspection, she noticed that between the wooden floor panels, some smaller glass ones were embedded. And below those glass panels, she could see tiny people moving about. It seemed like these corridors connected different areas for the little people. Her eyes followed the pathways and then noticed that the support beams had buildings for tiny people integrated into them. Ryung caught her gaze and said, that was Lix's idea. She's always finding new ways to house people and refugees on Magra so that they're as safe as possible. Barbie grinned. That's a fun idea. So, I guess that means entire cities are built into your house? Ryung nodded. You could say that. Lix collects so many people that we now have millions living here. I've stopped counting. But in Lix's garden and house, there are many, many more people. I think she has no privacy left for herself at this point. Barbie was surprised. I've seen that in her garden. But do they all come from planets in danger? Ryung became serious. Indeed. Some flee from major catastrophes that strike their planets. Other planets, like Anthro, were entirely destroyed by the techno-owls. And, well, some simply live in poor conditions and are looking for a better life. So Magra must be a good place to live, Barbie said aloud. It's a bit like a fantasy world here. Ryung gestured for Barbie to sit on a large cushion beside a small table. "Sit down, we have much to discuss," she said. Barbie sat carefully on the cushion and felt it yield slightly under her weight. It was incredibly comfortable. It was strange how fabrics and materials behaved at such an enormous size. But that wasn't all. Ryung took a teapot and poured Barbie a cup of tea, but the water didn't flow as she was used to. It seemed more like a waterfall cascading into the cup. The rushing water crashed into Barbie's cup and gradually filled it. Barbie accepted the cup and watched in fascination as the many tiny waves in the cup rolled, which for normal-sized people would be like a storm at sea. "What's wrong?" Ryung asked, noticing Barbie's intrigued expression. "Well, I have to admit, I'm not quite used to this size yet. The physics are just different. But it's pretty cool." Ryung grinned widely. "I can imagine. For me, it's always fascinating to shrink down and switch to the small perspective. Then everything seems so big and powerful." The two drank tea and talked about their experiences as giants and normal-sized people. Barbie shared stories about the events in Tokyo, where she was controlled by the evil Galaxia, and other experiences she had as a giantess. She told Ryung all about her last mission, where she rescued the residents of a burning city with the help of Rudo. Ryung listened intently, and when Barbie finished, she said, "That's remarkable. Without you, those people would probably have died." Barbie blushed. "Teehee. Well, that's nothing. I just had my fun as a giant heroine." Then Barbie tried to change the subject to something she was really curious about. She lifted her arm and pointed at her bracelet. "But tell me, Ryung. I thought the bracelet's shield would protect everyone around us, especially those in collapsing buildings or those we step on. But somehow, that didn't work last time. Thankfully, I also have the revive function." Ryung looked puzzled. "Mind if I take a look?" She moved closer to Barbie to inspect the bracelet. After a brief examination, she found the cause. The bracelet's shield is activated, but currently, it primarily protects you from harm. Because, here's the thing, Ryung explained in detail how the shield system worked, noting that it could protect the wearer and people in the vicinity. However, the polarity would switch back and forth depending on who needed protection at the moment, as both couldn't be done simultaneously. Lix had been dealing with hostile giants, robots, and other dangerous foes lately, which was why she'd seen the need for an update. She'd integrated the anklet's shield emitters, which were originally intended as backup, into the system for continuous activation. In this configuration, the bracelet would protect only the wearer, while the anklet generated the shields to protect everyone else. But this mode had to be configured after the update, so, it's just an update? But Lix didn't mention it. Barbie wondered. Ryung nodded. "It's been busy lately. I guess Lix just forgot." Barbie took another sip of her tea. Her lips touched the water's surface, and entire waves of water washed into her mouth. It felt like she was drinking an entire lake. After gulping tons of water down, she said, "Good thing we talked about it. I think I'll be able to handle the functions better now." Ryung smiled sheepishly. "We're all learning a lot right now. That's why we have the updates. There are many places in the galaxy in danger, and we're grateful for any help. You've already done so much as a giantess." Barbie waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, it's really nothing. And, to be honest, I sometimes just use my size to have fun rampaging around. Probably much to the dismay of some city dwellers. Like back in Seoul. But I'm always glad when I can use my size to help." Ryung finished her tea and then said, "I think you'll like the mission for today. It's not time critical, relatively relaxed, and we can get as destructive as we want." "You mean let our monster side out?" Ryung nodded again. "Yeah, you can have some fun. Just like in Seoul." Barbie grinned broadly. "Teehee. So we're just going to destroy a city, not just that." Ryung explained the difficult situation in which the Empress of Crypia currently found herself. How the entire planet was in an energy crisis, and how everyone was trying to overcome it. Ryung talked about Lix's adventure there and how her wrist computer had completely failed. "So, Lix caused not only enormous damage but also killed quite a few people?" Ryung nodded. "That's right. Fortunately, the people there have technology similar to our bracelets. They can also resurrect the dead. But that's only possible if they have enough energy, and that was not the case during the energy crisis. Luckily, it all worked out in the end. Lix was able to deliver much-needed energy crystals. The people were revived, and since then, the Empress has been trying to implement reforms. They're making good progress, but not in all regions. Some are too slow, and others are doing nothing. The Empress believes that the catastrophe Lix caused was also beneficial in some ways. It motivated people to change quickly, Barbie laughed. So, we're supposed to motivate other regions too? Teehee, Ryung laughed too. Exactly. We're going to motivate people a bit to do something for their future. This means we won't activate our shields, and in the city, it's okay if a lot of things get broken. It also provides an opportunity to practice something else, a second fallback strategy that's important for us giants. Barbie listened attentively and continued to sip the delicious tea as Ryung explained more details. It would be an interesting mission, and she looked forward to the new adventure and new challenges. Meanwhile, on the planet Crypia in the Oamor region, Helter, the mayor, sat with his family and some guests on the luxurious rooftop terrace on the 20th floor of his private residential building, enjoying a jug of red beer while discussing political topics with the guests. Some of whom were representatives. Helter stroked his large belly as he dismissed the concerns of a blonde representative as ridiculous and alarmist. That's absurd. Our generators have been operating for generations and still work perfectly fine. We don't need to change a thing. The rooftop terrace was bathed in bright sunlight, and the warmth was pleasant. Helter leaned back in his chair and took in the view. The sight of the city was grand, and he felt right at home. He took another sip of his red beer while the guests engaged in animated discussion. I understand there's some panic after the tragedy in the capital, Helter said, waving a hand dismissively, but our region is far removed from such dangers. Our energy supply is stable and secure. We shouldn't let hysteria guide our decisions. A young delegate, his golden tie slightly askew, shook his head. But what if there's a real problem? The old generators are outdated. If the crystal shipments get delayed again, we're in deep trouble. We're risking too much, Helter laughed. You're worrying too much, kid. These generators have been running for decades without a hitch. We don't need new technology that just complicates things without improving anything. It just adds more work. The blonde delegate, who had previously voiced her concerns, cleared her throat. The world is changing, Helter. If we don't adapt, we could find ourselves in real trouble. The energy crisis has shown how vulnerable we can be. Helter waved her off and took another sip of his beer. Bah. Crisis is too strong a word. We had a little hiccup, yes, but it was quickly resolved. People don't need new rules, they need stability. We'll get our crystals, don't worry. Good grief, our entire culture is based on these crystals. Why should we change that? No one wants to throw out the old just because something new comes along. The discussions continued, and some of the guests nodded in agreement with Helter, while others crossed their arms, remaining skeptical. Helter loved these debates because he knew he always had the majority on his side. It was a matter of comfort and convenience, and most people were averse to change. Let other cities make the adjustments. Helter was determined to preserve their way of life. Helica and Triver, Helter's children, sat at the table, initially listening attentively to the discussions, but they were becoming restless. Helica, the older of the two, was about 16 years old. She had long, dark hair tied in a ponytail and wore a simple but elegant dress. Triver, her younger brother, had a face full of freckles that highlighted his green eyes. He wore a casual t-shirt and shorts. Helica stood up and looked at her father. Dad, Triver and I want to go into town and meet some friends. Is it okay if we leave now? Her father looked surprised. But, you hardly ate anything. And we have guests. It's rude to leave so soon. The blonde delegate waved her hand. Oh, it's no big deal. Young people don't like boring conversations anyway. Triver nodded eagerly. Exactly. Besides, we want to see the new kaiju movie at the cinema. I've heard it's about Lix, the giant kaiju girl who destroyed the capital. Everyone at school is talking about it, and his sister added enthusiastically, oh, I'd love to be stepped on by her. It must be so incredible. The father rolled his eyes. Kaiju movies? Seriously? He asked, frowning. Why the hell do you like that sort of thing? It's degrading to imagine yourself getting stepped on by a gigantic foot, like you're nothing more than an insect. And those movies glorify destruction. Solving problems through violence is not the message I want you to take, Helica shrugged. Maybe, but they're exciting, Dad. And I don't know. I just like feeling small and overwhelmed, her brother added, and sometimes the kaijus are the heroes who save the world. Lick saved us, too. Now the father was truly annoyed. What do you mean, saved us? She caused massive destruction. The capital hasn't been the same since, but she brought crystals. Helter huffed and waved his hand. Enough. You won't be watching that movie. Disappointed, the children said their goodbyes, left the rooftop terrace, and headed to the elevator. As soon as the door closed behind them, Helica said, "We're totally going to the cinema." Dad doesn't have to know. Oh yeah, her brother cheered, and a few minutes later, they were on their way to meet their friends in the city. A little later at the edge of the city, four glowing points stretched apart, forming a massive, orange glowing rectangle. It was enormous, towering over many of the city's buildings. It looked like the sky itself had opened to let something monumental through. A giant foot emerged from the portal and gently set down on the ground. The earth trembled as the foot found its balance. Then, the colossal figure of the 200-meter-tall Barbie stepped out of the orange portal. Her purple shirt and yellow shorts gleamed in the reflection of the bright light. Her brown hair swayed gently around her shoulders as she carefully exited the portal and stood tall. She adjusted her stylish glasses as she curiously looked around. The city before her seemed tiny and fragile. Skyscrapers, which normally towered high, barely reached her chest. Only a few scattered buildings were taller than she was. The streets looked like narrow lines weaving a complex pattern through the city. The people moving about the streets were barely larger than ants, and at this moment, they seemed pretty shocked, a reaction Barbie had encountered quite often by now. Smiling, she stepped aside to make room for Ryung. The Asian giantess burst through the portal with a dramatic roll, landing with a thunderous crash. Her massive body crushed into the city, rolling over the first set of buildings, which instantly crumbled into dust. Giggling and coughing, she stood up and brushed the dust off her clothes. Barbie gave her a playful look. "Do you do that often?" "Whenever I feel like it. It's kind of fun." Ryung smiled. The 200-meter-tall Barbie and the slightly smaller Ryung stood side by side, gazing down at the tiny people in the streets below. The people looked up with a mix of awe and fear. Some were paralyzed with fright, especially after witnessing the destruction of the first few buildings. Others were simply fascinated by the incredible sight that unfolded before them. The sight of the two gigantic women was truly breathtaking. With a pounding heart, Barbie watched as some of the tiny people quickly fled, trying to escape, while others gazed up at her, waving or attempting to make contact in some way. "And you really want us to step on these poor people without using the shields?" Ryung nodded and deactivated her shield via the bracelet holo display. "Yes. That's kind of the point today." Barbie deactivated her shield as well, and took a first step into the city. Her barefoot crashed down with a thunderous boom, instantly crushing the first screaming people in a fraction of a second. As the people in the streets and buildings saw this, the mix of awe and fear quickly turned into panic. "Damn it. They're going to crush us all," screamed a blonde woman in terror. An older man tried to calm her, saying, "Don't worry. We have our resurrection machines. As long as they work, we're safe." Just at that moment, an extremely loud hissing sound echoed through all the streets as pink glowing energy rings hit a skyscraper. The building practically exploded in the middle, causing the top to come crashing down with a deafening roar, burying its immediate surroundings in dust and concrete debris. "Oh my God!" the man yelled. "Our generators. If they destroy them, the machines won't work anymore. We're doomed." Someone else shouted. Meanwhile, Ryung patted Barbie on the shoulder. "Wow. Nice shot." Barbie blushed. "Well, I've gotten pretty good with the blaster. I've been practicing." "That's a pretty powerful blaster. Interesting configuration you chose. I suspect the people in that building were basically pulverized." Barbie nodded. "Yeah, I really like these laser rings. It's totally my style." Ryung laughed. Then the people in the other skyscrapers with energy cores should be glad that you're about to destroy them with style. Laughing face, Barbie frowned. But tell me, Ryung, how do you know which building is a power plant? I mean, they don't have smokestacks or anything. Lix explained me that, it's always just the biggest buildings. That's all. Barbie aimed at the next tall building. Ah, got it. Then this tower is up next. The people inside the tower felt like everything was in slow motion, as the pink glowing energy rings approached them, their sheer size almost unimaginable, not to mention the incredible destructive force they carried. A couple embraced each other tightly one last time. Then their bodies were practically torn to shreds as the rings hit the building, causing everything to explode violently. Barbie fired again and again until she was confident that most of the power plants were destroyed. Meanwhile, Ryung used her arm blaster as well, firing green glowing energy orbs at the destroyed buildings, which caused greenery and all sorts of plants to sprout from the rubble. There. That should keep people from trying to repair these outdated power plants. From now on, these are all new parks. Barbie raised her hand. High five, and they slapped their hands together. We make a great team. But that was almost too easy, Ryung shrugged. Well, I did say it would be a laid-back mission. Basically, we can just have fun now. Barbie didn't need to be told twice. With a playful grin, she began walking through the city without much care for the many screaming people in the streets beneath her feet. She watched as many of the tiny figures vanished under her massive soles, accompanied by that satisfying crunching sound when she stepped down. It was an amazing feeling. Especially barefoot. There was this sense of power and freedom that always came with being a giantess, not to mention the intoxicating power rush. She kept strolling barefoot through the city streets, her 200-meter-high figure towering over most of the buildings. Her wavy brown hair danced lightly in the breeze as she cast her gaze over the city with a relaxed smile. With each step she took, she left deep footprints in the streets, filled with flattened cars and squashed people. Barbie's bare feet dragged small cars, objects, and countless people, crushing them under her colossal weight. The sounds of thunder, cracking, and crunching followed her every step. Ryung walked along a parallel street, also playfully destructive. Today was one of those rare occasions where she could let loose as a giantess, and she was determined to make the most of it. Ryung moved with almost regal grace down the street, her 160-meter-tall frame casting a dark shadow over the people below. Each step she took crushed countless cars and people beneath her soles. As Barbie reached an intersection, she looked to her left and noticed Ryung walking down a nearly perfect parallel street. An idea popped into her head, and she smiled broadly. Hey, Ryung. Barbie called, her voice booming across the city and echoing off the nearby buildings. I have an idea for a game. How about we see who can crush the most people by the next intersection? Our bracelets keep track, don't they? Ryung paused and tilted her head. That seems unfair, Barbie, she said with a slightly amused look. Your feet are bigger than mine. You're bound to crush more people. Barbie shrugged with a grin. Oh, come on, just for fun. Maybe you'll surprise me, Ryung thought for a moment as she looked around. The streets were filled with people, either running in panic or watching in awe. Finally, she shrugged and smiled. Okay, you've convinced me. But if I lose, I get to choose the next game. Barbie laughed. Deal. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. With a loud stomp, Barbie placed her foot down on the first section of the street. There was a group of people who were trying to flee into a building, some who were nervously sitting in their cars, and many who were simply trying to run away. But almost all of them were crushed beneath the unimaginably large bare soul of the brunette giantess. The noise was deafening, the shattering of glass, the crunching of bones, and Barbie's joyful laughter. It was just a simple step, yet it was charged with emotion. Meanwhile, on the parallel street, Ryung walked with her usual poise, ensuring that each step followed the other without leaving much space for people to escape. It almost looked like a catwalk, with her elegant movement crushing dozens of people beneath her feet. There was already chaos spreading throughout the city. And the two giantesses had only arrived a few minutes ago. Helica and Triver had navigated through the bustling streets of Oamor's downtown and finally arrived at the cinema. The large building with its brightly lit advertisements and long lines at the entrances was a magnet for teenagers and movie fans alike. Triver was particularly excited because the new kaiju film promised epic battles and massive destruction, exactly what he loved. "We're finally here," he exclaimed, bouncing with joy. Helica couldn't help but be infected by his enthusiasm. As they stood in line waiting for admission, Triver couldn't stop raving about scenes he had seen in the news about the actual incident with Lix. And then, when Lix simply tore down the building. "That was incredible," he said enthusiastically. "I wish I could experience something like that in real life. How cool would that be?" Helica laughed and nodded, even though she knew her brother sometimes exaggerated a bit. Yeah, but the coolest would be to be crushed by her. Completely squashed under her foot." She practically had hearts in her eyes as she said it. Suddenly, the mood in the crowd seemed to shift. Some people in the line looked into the distance and pointed at something that Helica and Triver couldn't initially see. A murmur spread, and some people began to get nervous. "What's going on over there?" Helica asked as she looked to the tops of the skyscrapers in the distance. There, on the horizon, behind the two skyscrapers, something could be seen from time to time. Something enormous. Two gigantic figures. Was it? No. They weren't kaijus. They were giants. Human giants. Two giant women, as tall as skyscrapers. "What the?" Triver began, but his words fell silent as the ground trembled slightly, and the distant sound of collapsing buildings and thunder echoed in the air. People in the line began to panic, some running away, while others simply stared with wide eyes. The cinema signs flickered as massive energy rings shot through the air, pulverizing a tall building. Helica felt her heart racing. She knew they had to act quickly. "Triver, we need to get out of here," she shouted, pulling her brother's arm as they tried to flee through the crowd, but Triver couldn't take his eyes off the giant women. This is unbelievable," he exclaimed, though the fear in his voice was unmistakable. "They're real. Giant women in our city. This is so cool. Why do you want to run away?" Helica knew they couldn't afford to waste any time. She had to get her brother to safety before the chaos got worse. "Come on, Triver. Because that was a generator building. The resurrection machines won't work. If we get trampled, we'll stay dead. That's why. So run for your life." Triver ran hand in hand with his sister. "But I thought you dreamt of being crushed." "Yeah. But not if I stay dead. Then I won't get to enjoy it. And now shut up and run." Their father had also noticed what had happened, even if he didn't want to admit it. "Oh my gosh. What is that?" exclaimed one of the delegates, jumping up as she watched a massive skyscraper crumble to dust. Helter also jumped up, blood rushing in his ears. Far in the distance, he could see them, two gigantic giantesses. And they were firing energy blasts at the power plants. This was not just a bad omen, it was a disaster. Everyone inside. "Quickly. We need to get down," shouted Helter, pointing to the entrance of the rooftop terrace. Panic-stricken, people rushed to the elevator, frantically pressing the buttons, but nothing happened. "Why isn't the elevator working?" cried one of the delegates in despair. Helter looked at the control lights, dark and unlit. "The power plants, they've destroyed them. We have no electricity." Reality hit everyone like a punch. Without power, there was no elevator, and the building had no staircase. After all, there were plenty of elevators. Even backup elevators for the rare occasion that one failed. But no one had ever expected the power to completely go out. At least not until recently. "What should we do?" asked a guest, their voice trembling with panic. Helter looked around, trying to keep his composure, but it was nearly impossible as he saw the two giants approaching threateningly. "Stay calm," Helter called out, but the people on the rooftop terrace began to panic as the earth trembled with each step of the giantesses. "We're trapped," someone shouted. "What should we do?" Helter gasped. "Hide somewhere and hope we're not seen." Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the city, a panicked crowd of people desperately tried to flee from the Asian giantess, but of course, they stood no chance. With graceful movements, her giant feet came down on the screaming people again and again, crushing them all to pulp. The fleeing people were naturally no match for the giants due to the drastic difference in size and couldn't run fast enough. But that wasn't all that made their escape difficult. Abandoned and crashed cars blocked the way, as did rubberneckers and people with cameras and other high-tech recorders trying to film the events. On the parallel street where Barbie was walking, it was similar. Literally thousands of people were crushed under the brunette giantess's bare soles, ending up as small red stains in her perfectly shaped footprints. Barbie caught almost all of them. Only a few lucky ones escaped, others tried to save themselves in side alleys. But Barbie also stepped on those, tearing down some of the buildings or flattening them entirely, just to improve her statistics. Barbie and Ryung reached the target intersection almost simultaneously. Both giantesses looked back at the path of destruction they had left behind. Deeply imprinted footprints in the streets, full of crushed cars and completely mashed human remains. And countless buildings were damaged or even completely destroyed. Barbie grinned. It's amazing how something as simple as a walk can have such extreme effects. Then she looked at Ryung and said, "You've already told me that this planet is something special, but I've noticed that many people aren't running away, but rather, letting themselves be, well, trampled to mush." Ryung nodded. Yes. There are many kaiju fans on this world. Giants are also very popular figures in entertainment. I think that's a reason, Barbie pondered. And you said these people aren't used to death here because they can practically live indefinitely? Maybe it's also a change for them to experience something different? Fear and even death, the Asian giantess shrugged. That could be. Something like thrill, Barbie laughed. Yeah. I mean, I've crushed a lot of people who were just staring at me. Maybe for them, it's like riding a roller coaster or going to a haunted house or something thrilling. Just experiencing something extreme. Ryung grinned even more. That wasn't our goal, but well. Then these people also get something out of it. But now let's see who won. Barbie opened the holographic interface of her wristband computer to evaluate the statistics. She smiled when she saw the number. "Hey, Ryung, how many did you get?" she called across the street. Ryung scrolled through her statistics and raised an eyebrow. "I crushed 14,426 people. Not bad, huh? What about you?" Barbie smiled confidently. "Oh, I got 21,952. I think that's called a clear victory, right?" Teehee. Ryung shook her head and chuckled softly. "Okay, you won. No surprises there. So, I get to suggest the next game. Okay, what do you have in mind?" Ryung grinned. "This time, the game is the exact opposite. We walk over the crowded streets, but whoever crushes the fewest people wins. No active shields. Nothing. Just pure skill. Are you ready?" Barbie nodded. "Okay, that's an interesting idea. Sounds like a challenge." She lifted her leg and glanced at her soul. Not only were crushed bodies stuck to it, but also some injured ones who were still alive. She knew from previous missions that it was possible to survive her steps if she was barefoot and stepped slowly and carefully. Well, at least for some lucky people. Ryung lifted her leg and rubbed her foot against the corner of a skyscraper's roof, brushing off all the crushed human remains, which slid down the building's facade as a pile of mashed flesh. Barbie followed suit and cleaned her feet in the same way with another building. In the process, the few survivors on their soles were inevitably crushed and ground. Ryung showed Barbie how to reset the counter of her wristband computer to start with a new statistic from this point on. "Okay, ready. Until the next big intersection. Let's go." Both started walking again, this time, a bit slower and more carefully. Meanwhile, Helica and Triver ran through the crowded streets, gasping for air, as more and more people panicked around them. The sounds of the giantesses in the distance grew louder, clearly indicating that they were approaching. The thunder of their footsteps echoed between the buildings. Triver looked around anxiously. "Helica, they're getting closer and closer. What should we do?" Helica tried to stay calm, but her hands were shaking noticeably. She felt the deep tremors of the ground with each step the giantesses took through the streets. "I don't know. We're too slow. Maybe we should find a place to hide." She turned around and widened her eyes, for the Asian giantess was on their street and, although moving quite slowly, rapidly approaching. That might be due to her immense size, as her over 80-meter-long legs could cover a great distance with each step, for which the small people had to run strenuously. Helica was equally anxious and fascinated. She watched as the giantess lifted one leg, swung it forward, and slowly lowered her bare foot onto the screaming mob. It was such a powerful yet elegant movement. It almost seemed hypnotic. Helica could only imagine what the people experienced who were crushed under this mighty foot. It must be beautiful, but also terrible. Her little brother suddenly pulled her arm. Helica. What's wrong? We should flee, right? The girl tore herself away from the sight of the Asian giantess. Yes. Yes, you're right. But running with the crowd won't save us. We need to get off this street. She nervously looked around. Even though she herself felt the inner desire to be crushed underfoot, she also knew she had the responsibility to protect her younger brother. There's an alley up ahead, maybe it's less crowded there, she called out and pulled her brother along. Just as they turned into the alley, they saw the giantess's enormous foot coming down. Those who couldn't escape quickly enough were mercilessly stepped on and pressed into the huge meaty sole. The street was now completely immersed in the deep shadow of the Asian giantess, towering high above everyone. Parts of her gigantic body were visible between the rooftops as she moved powerfully. Trevor stopped and stared up, his eyes wide open. Oh wow, she's incredibly huge. Helica was equally fascinated and fearful. The power emanating from the giantesses was overwhelming. Yes, that's truly incredible, she said hesitantly, but her heart was pounding with fear. The situation made her more nervous than she wanted to admit. Trevor turned to his sister. Do you think they'll really crush us and leave us dead? I mean, maybe they're just here to have fun, right? I mean, they look happy and amused. At that moment, one of the walls of a building collapsed as Ryung swung her other foot forward, destroying part of the structure in the process. Immediately, debris, dust, and rubble flew around the children and other fleeing people. Helica immediately grabbed Trevor's arm again and ran on. Out of the alley. But as they reached the other main street, they were swept along by another fleeing mob. Damn it. It's chaos here too, gasped Helica. And when she looked back, she knew why. There loomed the even larger brunette giantess directly above them. She was physically bigger, had larger feet, and therefore even greater potential for destruction. Helica was torn. She wanted to see it, she wanted to take it all in, but she also had to protect her brother. So she kept running and running. She had to at least try to survive. Barbie took careful steps, looking at her display. Speaking to herself, she read the number aloud. 120 people. Ryung turned around and looked at Barbie. Pardon, Barbie smiled sheepishly. I mean, I've crushed 120 people so far this time. That's much better than before. But I don't understand how you can walk so fast. I'm just taking one careful step at a time. She pointed to her feet as she took a step. Look, I move forward, wait until I find enough space for my heel, and then I step down. That way, no one gets crushed under my heel, that's a pressure point. But then I also have to step slowly with the rest of my foot, otherwise too many will get trapped under my toes and balls of my foot and be crushed. Ryung grinned. I've only crushed 5 so far. Barbie widened her eyes. What? Only 5? But how? Ryung blushed slightly. Well, it's all practice. Actually, I was hoping it would be 0. But there are some crazies here who jump under my heel because they want to be crushed. I don't have control over that. Barbie was puzzled. Even though Ryung was a bit smaller, only 5 people? That couldn't be possible. Could it? She stopped briefly and watched Ryung intensely as she continued walking. The Asian giantess took a step, swung her foot forward, and, just like Barbie, set her heel down in an empty spot. Then she let her soul sink into the crowd, and then she saw a small difference. Apparently, Ryung put particular pressure on her big toe and distributed little weight on the rest of her foot. Barbie had always stepped down very gently and tried to distribute the weight carefully. As a result, most could survive, but some were still crushed under her ball and toes. She thought for a moment and then tried to take the next step. Here we go. Let's try doing this properly. Helica and her brother had made some progress while the 2 giantesses talked, their voices echoing through the alleys like thunder. At least Helica thought so, but as she looked around, she realized it wouldn't be enough. The giantess took a step, and her long foot came incredibly close. Just a few rows of houses behind them, it came down and pressed the screaming people there to the ground. What a sight. But it was also demoralizing because she realized that all their efforts were hardly making a difference. Did they even have a chance to escape? she ran and ran, but then the entire mob came to a standstill again. The street ahead narrowed, and people could barely move forward. Helika's heart was beating fast and heavy. She breathed shallowly and quickly, sweat running down her forehead, as she dared to turn around again. She had suspected it, because at that moment she saw the pretty giantess's over 100-meter-long leg accelerate. She felt wind around her, felt the displacement of air, saw the huge, yet adorable toes come over her and obscure the sunlight. The dark soul, covered in dirt and debris, with people still stuck here and there, floated more and more above them until it seemed to cover the entire sky and steadily lowered. It was so incredibly beautiful and fascinating, yet so frightening. Helika swallowed nervously. She could now clearly feel herself trembling all over. Please don't get crushed, please don't get crushed. Her brother murmured to himself meanwhile, squeezing her hand tighter and just hoping they would survive. Helika cried and trembled as she simply stood still and watched the approaching wall of skin with fascination. She had dreamed of such an event for so long. But she didn't want anything to happen to her brother. The two of them weren't even adults yet, while their parents had already lived for over 200 years. That wasn't fair. Were they really going to die at this early stage in their lives? The heel descended with a tremor-inducing impact, and the rest of the soul lowered further and further, so that Helika, her brother, and all the people around them were pressed to the ground. Helika's knees gave way. She fell and noticed how the space around her became tighter and tighter as the wall of skin, adorned with a fascinatingly beautiful pattern of skin ridges, came closer and closer. Eventually, they were touched and slowly pressed into the soul. The skin ridges curved like huge louvers around their bodies. From this close, the line patterns looked like deep furrows in the giant skin. Furrows into which they were currently being pressed. Helika felt her limbs, her arms and legs. Searching for space and somehow adapting to the skin ridge pattern of the soul above them, trying to fit in somehow, Barbie moved very slowly and carefully. She set her foot down slowly and could perceive all the people beneath her soul, as well as feel their movements. Now, very gently, she spoke to herself as she tried not to put too much weight on her foot. Similar to Ryung, she tried to shift most of the weight onto the big toe and a little onto the ball. Slowly, very slowly, she applied more pressure. Helika and Trivor felt the pressure increase as Barbie's foot slowly settled completely on the ground. Trivor screamed in fear, while Helika tried to calm herself down. They were pressed more and more firmly against the ground as Barbie's soul gently touched the pavement. The warmth and softness of the soul were overwhelming, and they felt every muscle movement like the motion of immensely powerful machines above them. The foot fully touched down, and they weren't dead. It didn't even hurt that much. Thoughts raced through their heads as they tried to orient themselves. Helika, what's happening here? Trivor stammered, his voice muffled by the skin around him, full of confusion. Helika could hardly speak, so overwhelmed was she by the situation. I don't know, Trivor. But we're safe, right? They felt every movement of the giantess above them as they tried to control their fears. Then, they felt distinctly how Barbie slowly moved. The foot rolled off. They felt the pressure increase for a moment, then suddenly, they were lifted into the air. Bright sunlight briefly hit their faces, buildings passed by, and strong wind swept around their bodies as they continued to be firmly pressed into the soul. They were stuck to the soul of the giantess, just as Helika had thought that, everything around her whirled, and suddenly she saw the huge face of the giantess hovering high above her with a concentrated expression. Barbie glanced at her soul. Apparently, this technique had worked well. The people stuck to her foot all seemed to be okay and well. No crushed remains, no blood, just little cute bodies pressed into her skin ridges. Barbie grinned. Teehee. Hello, little ones. Hope you're comfortable. I'll be on my way then. She lowered her foot back onto the street and glanced at her hollow display. The number was still at 120. She wouldn't win against Ryung with that number, but at least her stepping technique had worked so well this time that she hadn't crushed anyone, not a single one. Even with her shield still inactive. And wasn't that the goal? That was quite good. She spoke to herself. Let's keep going like this. Slowly but somewhat more confidently, Barbie continued, walking over the crowd that felt like a living carpet. It was an interesting sensation, feeling so many tiny bodies under her feet and knowing that they were all real people. Scared people who were probably wondering what was happening to them. These people, including Helica and Triver, were being pressed deeper into the soul with every step. Again and again, they felt the G-forces as Barbie's legs swung forward, felt the wind blowing around them, and then the impact, the pressure, and the warm soul folding around them. It was like a roller coaster ride and then like being pressed by a mattress, if that made sense. But could this amazing experience even be compared to anything? The siblings had by now accepted that they were stuck to the soul, and that they couldn't escape. Triver had become completely calm, while Helica finally felt free to fully savor and enjoy the situation. She loved it. She was glued to a soul like an insect and was being squashed over and over again. And it felt so good. Another step, and they were pressed down against the ground again. Helica closed her eyes and let everything sink in intensely. The warmth and pressure were both soothing and terrifying. The skin of the soul was warm and soft, yet firm and strong. They felt the big lines and indentations on the skin above them, which had a rough texture but also a certain suppleness. The pressure they felt with each step was considerable, and the feeling overwhelming, but not painful at all. It truly felt as if they were surrounded by a soft mattress that gently enveloped and supported them. The warmth of the soul was pleasant and calming, and it felt more and more like they were becoming part of the skin they were embedded in. A faint scent of skin care products lingered in the air, mixed with the various smells of dust, concrete, shattered metal, and other things, and a hint of Barbie's foot scent. It was a fascinating combination that somehow felt soothing to Helica. Similar experiences were had by the people under Ryung's feet. Hundreds of people were now stuck to her soles, being squashed again with each step. Some tried to free themselves, which, of course, didn't work, while others accepted that they were completely helpless and tried to calm themselves. A few even enjoyed being repeatedly enveloped and softly squashed by the meaty soul. The people in the streets were, of course, still mostly frightened. Although some had noticed that the giantesses were now moving slower and more carefully. As always, Ryung enjoyed the fearful screams of the people. It amused her that so many people panicked just because she was walking down a street. There was also fear and panic on the rooftop terrace of Helter as the two giantesses approached. Everything shook and rattled under the thunderous steps of the two titans. Trembling, Helter's guests crouched in their hiding spots. Some were behind crates or barrels. One was under the table, others had hidden behind beams near the elevators. Still others simply lay flat on the ground, hoping to avoid the gaze of the giantesses. A delegate who had hidden behind a barrel of beer screamed loudly when she briefly stood up to see what was happening, only to behold the Asian giantess towering above. She was very close, just one street away, and stopped because Helter's building stood at that very intersection where Barbie and Ryung wanted to meet to evaluate the statistics of their second game. Ryung arrived at the agreed-upon intersection and stopped. She waited briefly for Barbie to arrive as well, then said, "Okay, time to count." Barbie, who had practically stopped right in front of Helter's building, casting its rooftop terrace into shadow, took a deep breath, looked at her display, and then made Helter's guests tremble with fear as her voice boomed, 125. Damn it. I squished a few more. Ryung glanced at her own number. I've got 9. Didn't quite make it without casualties either. But, she paused briefly, looking at Barbie. You've made great progress since the last check. I don't think I've ever seen anyone learn so quickly and without detailed explanation. Barbie blushed. Well, maybe being a gentle giantess is in my blood. Teehee, both laughed, and Ryung nodded. I think so too. This stepping technique is important in case the bracelet fails for some reason. You'll still be able to walk through a city without causing unnecessary casualties. Barbie shrugged. But I'm glad we have the bracelets. The shields are helpful, and if I'm honest, I also like the reviving beam. I don't have to worry too much. And letting loose and squishing people occasionally is quite fun. The delegate on the rooftop far below Barbie trembled even more as she heard those echoing words. Tears streamed down her face. I want to get out of here, she cried desperately. I don't want to be squished. Helter waved to her from his hiding spot, trying to reassure her. Just be quiet. We just need to stay quiet, then nothing will happen to us. Ryung grinned and squinted. I get it. As a giant, I want to have fun now and then too. But you're able to control your emotions and prioritize people's well-being. I'm really glad to have you on our team. Barbie blushed again. Thank you. I'm glad to be a part of it too. But enough with the praise, okay? Ryung shrugged. I don't have anything else anyway. I think the mission was a success. You've already mastered the stepping technique I wanted to show you. We've also gone through how the bracelet shield works, and we've destroyed the power plants in this city. So we're done. Ryung smiled. Barbie thought for a moment. No. We're not quite done. Ryung was surprised. Oh, why? What else is there? Barbie smiled. Since we're already here, I want to have a bit more fun. We haven't destroyed that much yet. She wanted to sit down for a moment and looked around for a good spot. Buildings were everywhere, but at least one looked sturdy. She turned around and slowly lowered herself onto the building, on the rooftop terrace beneath Barbie. The shock was immense as the giantesses' colossal butt descended upon them. Everyone stared up in horror, knowing that this was their end. Everything went dark, and entire walls crumbled as Barbie's behind touched the terrace and pressed down on it. Helter, his guests, and the delegates were all instantly crushed under Barbie's butt. Meanwhile, Barbie felt the building give slightly under her weight. She paused briefly, then settled down properly once she was sure the building was stable enough to support her weight. The rooftop terrace and the top floor were completely destroyed. And the people inside were all crushed. In the lower floors, people trembled in fear, hoping the building would withstand the pressure. The walls around them creaked, and steel beams squeaked. Plaster crumbled from the overloaded walls, but fortunately, the building did not collapse. Barbie crossed her legs and took a deep breath. A short break felt good, but she wasn't ready to leave yet. Let's do something fun, she said with a smile. Ryung approached. What did you have in mind? Barbie thought for a moment, then angled her legs slightly so she could see her soul. First, I want to check who's stuck to my foot. Her eyes scanned her soul, examining the tiny people stuck to it. Most of them looked pretty exhausted. Even if most were not injured, it must have been super exhausting to be squished over and over again. Barbie waved to the people and asked with a smile, how are you feeling? Disappointingly, no one replied. Ryung laughed. I think they're all pretty beat up. Barbie grimaced. They're so boring. Let's see how it looks on my other foot. She let her leg glide down and placed her foot back on the street. Then she crossed her legs in the opposite direction to examine her other sole. Ryung leaned down and also observed the tiny people stuck to Barbie's sole. Helica and Triver had been wedged between the sole and the asphalt for quite some time, sweating profusely due to the heat radiating from Barbie's skin. But eventually, the foot lifted again, and they felt a fresh breeze around their ears. When Helica opened her eyes, she saw the blurry faces of the two giantesses above her. This is incredible," whispered Helica as her vision cleared, her voice full of relief and fascination. Triver, stuck right beside her, nodded in agreement, his heart still racing with excitement. "Yes, it really is. I'm speechless. Hey there, down below. How are you liking it under my foot? Any comments?" A rather battered woman next to Triver cried out desperately, "How was it?" "Terrible. Please let me go, you monster." That wasn't the response Barbie had hoped for. "Was it that bad?" wondered the American giantess, reaching with thumb and forefinger to detach the woman from her soul, but accidentally crushing her in the process. "Oops. Sorry." Quickly, she ground the body to pieces and wiped the remnants on a nearby building. Helica pulled her head out of the skin fold and looked over at her little brother. "Should we try talking to the giantess?" "Yeah," he replied. "But what do you want to say? What do you think?" "Just how we felt." After all, she did ask. Helica looked up at Barbie and shouted as loud as she could, "It was great." Barbie looked surprised to hear that, and Ryung couldn't help but grin. "Really?" Barbie asked curiously. "Yes. It was awesome." Triver shouted this time, confirming his sister's words. And Helica, completely overwhelmed by the situation, suddenly began to talk like a waterfall. She recounted how they had run away in fear but had no chance of escaping. How she had always been a kaiju fan and had long dreamed of being squished. And how wonderful it was to experience that for real. Barbie laughed. "What? You wanted to be squished? Really? But I'm not a kaiju. I'm just big. This time, Trevor exclaimed, that's even better. You look really awesome, Barbie blushed. Thank you. Teehee. Ryung stood beside Barbie and laughed. I think you've got some new fans. Helika seized the opportunity and asked, can we stay on your foot? Please squish us some more. Oh yeah, her brother loudly agreed. This time, even 2 or 3 other people stuck to the foot chimed in, getting caught up in the idea. Barbie laughed again. You guys are really funny. But if you want. Sure. I can keep trampling you for a while longer. Barbie looked at Ryung. What do you think? Shall we trample this district into the ground? Ryung grinned. How about dancing and karaoke? We could dance everything to the ground here. Barbie's face lit up. Yes. Dancing like that time at the karaoke bar in Korea? That would be awesome. That was really fun. Barbie looked back down at the small people stuck to her soul. You better brace yourselves. It's going to be a wild ride. She activated the shield on her bracelet and showed it to Ryung. Is this right? Ryung nodded. Yes. That should provide sufficient protection for everyone. Perfect. Barbie stood up, causing some debris from the building to rain down from her behind, and pulled her smartphone out of her pocket. Helika, her brother, and everyone else stuck to Barbie's soul found themselves wedged between the ground and the soul again when Barbie stood up. And they were curious about what the giantess had in store for them. Let's see if I still have some of those Korean songs. Barbie said as she scrolled through the titles on her smartphone. Ryung stood beside her to see what was on offer. Then Ryung pointed at a song. How about this one? It was actually fun to dance to, and the lyrics aren't too difficult. Bar Bar Bar? By Crayon Pop? Yes, that's the group with the bicycle helmets, right? They're hilarious. Barbie selected the song and propped her smartphone on one of the taller skyscrapers, causing the roof to partially collapse. Ryung also activated her shields as the melody began to play. The speakers of the giant smartphone have been so extremely loud that the song could be heard loud and clear in the entire city. Barbie also selected the revival function of her bracelet, allowing the blue beam to sweep across the destroyed areas of the city, bringing back to life and fully healing all those who had died during their rampage. Barbie winked at Ryung. I don't want people to miss our performance, and here we go. Ryung was already singing along with the Korean part, causing windows in the area to shatter from the reverberation of her booming voice. She pretended to hold a microphone and tried her best to mimic the dance moves of the Korean singers shown on the phone display, although she didn't quite succeed. Barbie laughed at Ryung's ridiculous moves and eventually joined in the song as it transitioned into the English part. Get, set, ready, go. Jumping. Jumping. Everybody. Jumping, she sang, mimicking the jumping movements, causing the entire city to tremble around them. Buildings collapsed everywhere around Barbie and Ryung. All just from the vibrations. Jumping, jumping, the two continued to sing, while trampling everything around them. Normally, by now, everyone under their feet would have been pulverized, but because all the people in the vicinity of the giants were protected by their shields, they could only experience what it felt like to be heavily stomped into the ground by the colossal strides of the two titans. The streets literally split open, concrete rubble flew through the air, and parts of buildings crashed to the ground, all simply because the two giantesses were joyfully dancing. I don't want to stick at home, now. Sang Barbie, and Ryung freestyled, so let's keep trampling here some more now. The people in the buildings watched with bated breath as the two giants performed their peculiar antics, while those in the streets continued to flee in panic. But time and again, the immense feet of the giants thundered down, stamping people into the ground. Many were left unconscious or completely disoriented in the deep footprints, while others clung to the soft soles of their huge feet. However, the swift dance movements and powerful stomps also dislodged many people from their soles, sending them flying in all directions. Some collided with building walls, others landed on the street or on cars, but no one was injured, thanks to the protective shields. Even Helika and Trevor were briefly sent airborne as Barbie made a swift sidestep. The siblings slammed against the windows of an office tower, which then collapsed as Barbie stomped forcefully nearby, causing the entire area to tremble violently. Afterward, The two siblings found themselves disoriented and confused but full of excitement amidst the rubble of a building. "That was awesome," exclaimed Trevor, and his sister laughed. "Totally, but now I need to rest. I'm totally exhausted." Helica leaned back and simply enjoyed the spectacle that presented itself to her as she saw the two titans above her and their feet repeatedly stamping up and down close by, while the earth shook violently over and over again. This was all too good to be true. The two happy giantesses tried to sing along and maintain the funny dance choreography, making the bizarre jumping movements, but they looked completely unprofessional and ridiculous. Barbie danced and couldn't stop laughing at the absurd movements they made while dancing as incredibly huge giants in a crowded metropolis. Then came the next Korean part in the song, and Barbie tried to sing along but failed miserably. When Ryung heard the strange words that sounded like an alien language, she laughed so hard while dancing that she stumbled forward, destroying several skyscrapers in the process. Barbie, already amused by Ryung's awkward dance style, burst out laughing as she noticed her Asian friend completely out of rhythm and balance. Barbie tried to lean against a building, but it wasn't stable enough and collapsed under her, causing Barbie to fall and crush an entire district under her body. Houses exploded everywhere, and concrete dust filled the air. Ryung collapsed beside Barbie on the ground, laughing so hard she was crying. "Haha. That looked so funny. You have no idea." Barbie rolled onto her back, holding her stomach and giggling as more buildings collapsed beside her. "Do I look funny? You should see your dance. Miserable doesn't even begin to describe it, XD, Ryung continued laughing. "And while we're fooling around here, we're destroying the entire city. Poor people here." Barbie waved it off. "Oh, come on, they're fine. They'll have a good laugh too when they see us." Ryung took a deep breath. "Oh yeah, you're right. That was really cool. Fooling around with you is the best pastime." Barbie turned her head to Ryung. "Hold on. You don't want to stop yet, do you? That was just one song. I have so much more on my list." Ryung pushed a building aside, which crashed down with a loud noise, to get a better look at Barbie and then said, "But if we keep going, there won't be much left of this city." "Oh, come on. It doesn't matter. The people here have to rebuild their city anyway. Let's sing a little more." Ryung stood up and brushed the concrete dust off her clothes. Then she took a deep breath. "All right. Let's keep going. What other songs do you have?" Barbie happily stood up and selected another song to which she could sing along better. The two sang and danced, destroying one neighborhood after another until hardly any intact buildings remained. They simply had a lot of fun and a great time. Time passed, and it became evening. Time to leave without cleaning up and leave the devastated city to its inhabitants. Of course, Ryung and Barbie made sure that all people were restored and that everyone was okay. The city was a rubble, which was naturally sobering for the population, but also a good incentive to finally build new power plants. Mission accomplished. Barbie thought aloud and disappeared with Ryung through the portal. Helica and Trevor stood in the rubble, dreamily watching the two giantesses disappear. "That was so cool," said Helica. Her brother wondered, "Do you think they'll come back again?" Helica shrugged. "I don't know. But I hope so." The portal closed, and Helica looked at her brother. "Okay, time to go home, or what's left of it. Dad is probably furious." "Oh, yes. I don't think he'll appreciate our city being destroyed by giants. He never really liked kaijus and giants." As they trudged through the rubble, both suddenly burst out laughing. "He's going to be so red and boiling with anger. Yeah, his hat will fly off with fury." They continued on, making fun of their father, who was indeed currently sitting angrily in the ruins of his private apartment building, muttering to himself, "Damn giants. Such garbage. Next time, I'll insist on having a damn staircase in my building. Arg. I hate giants." The sun was slowly setting as numerous relief troops from the Empress arrived with supplies and materials, ready to help. There was a lot of work ahead of them, but it would be worth it. The end. That was the story, Barbie's training with Ryung. We hope you enjoyed the story. For more stories from and with BiggerBetterBarbie, check out her gallery. For more stories to listen to, subscribe to our channel and also check out our Patreon page. Thank you very much.